I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Randy, with 10-year background in education and visual arts, has developed a curiosity for how information and interaction can build meaningful human connections. In early 2020, he switched careers amidst peak COVID lockdown. He's currently a designer at the Chicago-based design firm Grand Studio. He has contributed to a wide variety of digital solutions. When he's not designing, he loves running and enjoys competitive games of Monopoly with his 3 boys. I'm super excited to welcome Randy to the talk today, and I'm gonna leave it over to him now.
Thanks, Hannah. What an intro. Appreciate that. And hi to everybody else that's in the group and in the room and watching either here on YouTube Live. Appreciate you guys taking the time out as I share a little bit about my journey. So let me start. Let me get my screen going here. Alrighty. So hello and welcome. And I actually want to begin our time today with a quote that my manager had actually mentioned to me, right? And which ended up being the overarching theme of what today's discussion will be about. So my manager and I, we were having a discussion, and towards the end of our time, he said, "Self-awareness is the beginning of all wisdom." And I paused for a second and I started to laugh a little bit because not only is he always dropping these nuggets of wisdom at just the right moments when I need them, but something also just clicked for me in a fresh way. I'll start with this today because it'll be the lens that we'll be viewing today's conversation with. And as you're all aware, right, today's talk is titled Lessons Learned First Year as a Designer. But I think a more appropriate title would be a retrospective. Those in the design space, which is all of us here, or most of us, may be familiar with this term, as retrospectives are often used to reflect on what might have went well in a project, maybe evaluate what didn't go well, and then what are those adjustments that can be made for making improvements moving forward. And there's a ton of insights and a ton of lessons that have been valuable to me in this first 12-month journey. And I want to use the time today to distill them into 3 areas that have had the most impact on me personally. And again, that's what it is. This is my personal story, but my hope today is that no matter what level or role you're in, whether you're a mid, senior, or lead designer, or you're changing careers or just starting your career out, my hope today is that you'll be able to take away an insight or hear something in a fresh way that may click for you and that you can take with you. So let's dive in. The 3 areas that I want to talk about today will be intent, that there's more to design than being a designer, and reflection. So let's begin with intent. I actually want to start this section by posing a riddle to you all. Feel free to just think about it, or you can throw in some answers in the chat. But the riddle goes like this. 5 frogs are sitting on a log, and 5 decide to jump off. How many are left? Okay, I see 1, I see 5, 0. All right. The answer is 5. Good job, y'all. And for those of you that didn't answer 5, why is it 5? Because there's a difference between deciding and doing, right? Those frogs were deciding, but they never actually did anything about it. Intention is described and defined as this state of mind that represents committing to carrying out an action. This involves usually some planning and some forethought, and then carrying out that action in a purposeful manner. But why does this matter, and why do we want to start with this? So we want to start here because this frame of mind puts you in this place of not just going through the motions, especially when it's coming to your career, right? And this may happen when you're first finding your footing, but eventually it boils down to owning your expertise. My manager always tells me that as designers, the people we work with are leaning on us to our point of view, right? And it actually reminds me of team sports. When I was in elementary, I used to play basketball, and my position was point guard. There were also forwards, guards, and a center on the court. And although we operated as one, we also had our own role to make the whole thing work, right? We also won championships, which was awesome. But back to my point, similar in our design practice, and I'm speaking for myself, I learned and continue to be reminded that we got to take a stance and take a position with our role. So have a point of view. Or in the wise words of designer James Victor, he says, have a damn opinion, will you? So continue on the subject of intent, right, is how this directly affects us growing in our craft and what we're actually bringing to the table. When I started my design journey, my initial intent was to find an environment that I identified was mature in their design practice, where I can both contribute and at the same time lean on those that were more experienced than me, right? And then from that would nurture my growth. So because I had my sight set on that frame of mind, it helped me to identify what kind of place I wanted to be in. We fast forward a little bit over a year, and I continue to learn something new every day, right? With this sort of like teachable mindset. But I also have set much more specific intentions and goals that will allow me to be more valuable in my work, in my organization, and in my own practice. As I said, I came into this industry with the focus in visual design, right? And that's what I would consider as my core ability still, and an area of design that I'm really passionate about, right? To be able to take information and structure it in a manner using color, space, typography, motion, right? That people will interact with. It just fascinates me. However, I learned that if I wanted to build this stronger point of view that we just talked about, and if I wanted to see things from different, unique angles, and B, increase my value to my organization and in my work and help move that needle in a positive direction in a business sense, I had to push my range, right? As I've said, visual design was my core discipline starting out. And it's a facet of design that I just continue to be passionate about and lean on as my core foundation. But I've learned quickly that it's just one piece of this bigger picture that we call design, right? When I was in a position to start working on a team, I had to communicate my thinking well. When presenting work, I had to think, how am I crafting this story? And how am I contributing to facilitation in design reviews or in meetings that we're having? Am I walking through prototypes of our explorations to tell that story better? Right? And as out of my comfort zone that it was, opportunities ended up opening up for me to contribute to the research phases of our projects. And I realized in order to intentionally grow in my craft and in my thinking, and to just add more value to my team and my work, I had to get out of my own bubble. This allowed me to start developing different perspectives, as I've said, and to view various approaches to the problem spaces we were challenged with, and really grasp the power of design in and of itself. The truth is that there's no shortcuts around growing in your craft as a designer. There's no shortcuts in growing in your thinking. And yes, time and experience are some variables that need to be considered. But a few things that I was intentional about in my first year that helped me grow, right, were attentive observation. Let's start here. There's a quote that says, the difference between good design and great design is paying attention to the details. And I still make it a point to make that effort to show up every day and attentively observe, right? Observe the landscape that you're in, the work, observe the behaviors and patterns of people, observe the trends that are out there, and I was observing my teammates, right? I was observing how they handled situations, how they were fielding questions, right, during meetings. And then especially learning from those that have had much more experience than myself has been really invaluable. So observation has allowed me to study my environment in real time. Next, curiosity. Continue to feed your curiosity. We work in a people-centered business, right? And there are so many factors in play that may potentially strike our attention. So take the time to dig deeper. There's another quote I want to reference that I came across that says, if you're somebody who likes to think about things and learn about things, it's almost impossible to cancel curiosity. And that sounds like a lot like our role as designers. And just want to throw a fun fact in here. When I started my role in Grand Studio, I'd always say, I have a question, and then proceed to ask the question. And I was asking questions left and right about everything. And it almost became this sort of inside joke between our team. But that actually put me in this like teachable position. Asking the right questions is a tool, right? It's not any kind of weakness or barrier, but it's a tool, a powerful tool that allows you to overcome hurdles and get clarity and alignment on the things that we're trying to solve as designers. And then investing in yourself, right? This is an area that has helped me grow outside of the experience that I'm already gaining in the workplace. And for me, I just believe it's just necessary if you desire to take your craft to that next level, right? It requires some sort of initiative, right, to develop yourself. So whether that's, just simply subscribing to a newsletter, following a trend, or, you're reading a business book or a design book, or you're taking a course, you are feeding your growth, right? And actually earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to have taken Jeff and Hannah's course at the Fountain Institute, just as an example. So continue to feed that growth. Being intentional requires effort and strategy on how you use your time. The question you can ask yourself is, do you have a strategy for your growth? Right? In this ever-changing, ever-evolving landscape that design is, it's part of our job to kind of keep up with what's going on out there as best as we can so that we can continue to bring the best solutions to these problems. Right? I've learned that if we choose not to be intentional with our time, it'll end up being filled with other things, right, that may not end up serving us well. So give your time a job. Give those minutes, give those hours, give them a job. A few other helpful questions for this first section that we're talking about here with intent is ask yourself, what are you doing with your downtime? Where do you want your career to go? What trajectory do you see this going? And what are you doing to help you get there? If you're fortunate to have somebody such as a colleague or a mentor that you can confide in, share your thoughts, share your goals. There's power in voicing those things out. And if you don't know, reach out, ask, right? There's power in sharing your plan or your career goals with another person. Not only does this create accountability for yourself, but you have sort of like this lens in which you can find clear opportunities to meet those goals that you've set. So the takeaway here is set clear targets for yourself, right? Similar to a design project where there's strategy involved in setting a course of action. There's also constraints, right, that you have to set and design within. But this allows us to narrow our focus and make decisions with clarity. And of course, right, this sounds nice, but it's not always going to be linear. Your goals will shift, things will shift and adjust, and you'll need a pivot. You'll face resistance, most definitely. But make it a point to share those goals and share where you want to go and on your path. This actually requires you sitting down and writing or typing them out. I've found when writing or typing out either some thoughts or notes or my goals, it actually builds a confidence in you. And it's sort of like a morale booster in a sense. Knowing you have an objective that you're working on and it's not just floating around in your mind. And the principle here is new skills can open new doors of opportunity. And to wrap this first section, that, just remember, by being intentful, you're giving yourself permission to be the best version of yourself over and over and over again, right? We're making deposits to shape that future path and the future trajectory for our future selves. It's powerful. And this brings us to our second section. It's more to design than being a designer. And what I mean by this is that I want to talk about more than just the tangible side of this craftsmanship that we kind of just talked about in this first section. So I actually want to start this part referencing Michael Jonda. If you're not familiar with who that is, he's a graphic designer and he wrote a book called Burn Your Portfolio. And he says, in order to succeed in the design industry, it's imperative that you remember that you're not the sum of your work. Now, that may come off the wrong way, or might have rubbed some people the wrong way. Because I do acknowledge that as designers, this is our livelihood in a sense, right? Our work is a huge part of our lives. But I bring this up because the work will always be there. Now, design's an iterative process, and the work we put out there will always be critiqued, always be subject to feedback, but it's supposed to. And continuing with Michael Jonda, the reference that I was using earlier, he also states that if you interpret design critique as a character critique, you're putting yourself in this defensive position, right? That will end up impeding your ability to improve your design skills, and it will also impede your ability to adapt to different creative environments. In essence, he's saying we can put ourselves in a safe zone that may feel good temporarily. We may be really, really good in that safe zone, but in the long run, we're actually doing a disservice to ourselves. We're putting sort of like a cap on our growth. You know, when I was in art school, I went into the Art Institute of Chicago. And after every project, we would do class critique. And it was one of those things that always made me anxious. And fast forward, now I'm in the design space, right? Over the last year and a half, let's take that. I've had my work reviewed dozens of times. I've given feedback to my colleagues, and I've received feedback from my colleagues. And it's just part of the process. The problem was that, and it's something that I'm still working on, is that there have been moments where I would take that personally as if it were a personal attack on me and my character. And that's where it gets dangerous, because then you start, getting into that territory of imposter syndrome mode, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. The thing is, when you're so close to your work, you can develop this sort of attachment and this bias, right, to the things that you're doing because you see them every day. A key to growing in our design craft is to welcome that feedback, acknowledge that it's just part of this process, and surround yourself with the people who will challenge you, right? Surround yourself with those people whom you trust and can lean on as advisors to your work. Similar to my sports reference earlier, might use sports a few times here and there. But between my coaches and my teammates, we were always helping each other improve our jump shot, our handles, our defense, and more. And when it comes to design, I had to remind myself that I'm not just designing for me, myself, and I, but that this is for other people. And yes, this may not be earth-shattering insights to some of you, right? But those moments I feel were absolutely necessary for me to experience, so I can acknowledge that I'll be challenged, and that the feedback is there to push you, right? To push your work in that better place that will eventually be out of our hands anyway, right? And this leads me to the next point in this section, which is the environment that you surround yourself in. Take a moment to ask yourself, does the environment that I'm in support and align with my goals? Do they support and align with my interests? In the first section about intent, I mentioned that when I was starting my career, I knew I wanted to be in that environment that supported both growing a career path, but where I can continue to contribute and learn and grow at the same time. An example of an extremely valuable component for me as far as being in a supportive environment has been mentorship. I'm aware that having a mentor may not be for everybody, but for me, having people to lean on that have walked that path way before I have allowed me to identify blind spots. They've helped me uncover both strengths and weaknesses in myself that I didn't even know were there in the first place. These people are also able to share insight with you pertaining your career trajectory and goals because they have, in a sense, that bird's eye view. And listen, we don't know what we don't know. We have our own limitations, our own biases, our own assumptions, but surrounding yourself with those people that have had experience, right? They can help you cut through the clutter and challenge you at the same time to help you approach things in a fresh way. The last point that I want to cover in this section and dive into is fueling yourself outside of work. Right now, what do I mean by this? Well, you can begin by asking yourself, what are those things outside of work that you're passionate about? Okay, if you think about it, right, is it a hobby? Maybe it's baking and sports. Maybe it's working out. Maybe it's family time. I don't know, is it playing chess? I don't know what that looks like for you all. For me, I love running and I love family time. I'm fortunate to have a wife and 3 boys whom I cherish and looking forward to hanging out with them after this talk. And we have a blast, right? They're my biggest supporters and they keep me grounded. The second part of fueling yourself outside of work is to look outside, like literally step away from your desk, right? And study things that have nothing to do with your work. Simon Sinek, that name may sound familiar to you all, but he says it best. He's like, to truly think differently and innovate, we need to look outside of our own work, outside of our own industries. He goes on to say that if we see and learn how others solve problems, we can adapt and apply those same lessons in our own work. So the takeaway here is stay fresh. Surround yourself with those that have your best interest and actually want to contribute to your career growth. Embrace those things outside of work that can ground you or spark an insight, right? These are things that can allow us to have fresh perspective and prevent burnout. They can help us create a new perspective in our work and re-engage in our work in a fresh, meaningful way. So stay fresh, my friends. And this brings us to our last section that I want to talk about, which is reflection. Now, this section about reflection will help tie together the previous parts that we've covered. We started this talk referring to retrospectives, and I also mentioned that this design space is always evolving ever so quickly. It's easy to get caught in this day-to-day routine of sprints and pumping out work and going to the next meeting. But if there's no room made for reflection, it's difficult to really gauge where you stand. Over the past year and some change, I've really embraced taking a moment to pause, to take a breath, right? And essentially, it's this pausing that allows us to progress. Here's our sports reference again, right? In motorsports, there are pit stops where the driver has to take a pause after their vehicle has been taking a beating, going lap after lap. During those pit stops, the team refuels the vehicle, changes the tires, and makes the necessary adjustments so the driver can continue the race. Or using basketball as an example again. I've mentioned that, I'm so awesome at it. No, I'm just kidding. But there are timeouts and there are half times that are used to pause and discuss critical plays and gauge where your team is at against the other. Or in the design space itself, right? There are retrospectives, as I've been referring to, where after a project, you and your team can gain some insights by talking about what went well, maybe what didn't, and what are some things that we can work on as a team to improve moving forward. In essence, learning to pause allows growth to catch up to you. We're moving and we're moving and we're moving along this path. And because we've built this routine of movement and action and completing tasks, right? The experiences that we've encountered and the challenges we've had to overcome can't actually keep up the pace with ourselves because we're just constantly moving. So pause and let the understanding of those experiences catch up to you. Here's a quote by Peter Drucker. He says, "Follow effective action with quiet reflection. And from the quiet reflection will come even more effective action." To me, this quote really drives the point home of this whole topic that we're talking about. We see here how action and reflection are emphasized and repeated to point out how action and reflection feed on each other in this loop. After a period of reflection, I found that it's allowed me to engage back into my work, as I've said before, with a different perspective, and it helps me to see things at a fresh angle that maybe I didn't see before and maybe I missed before. And yes, we're busy, I get it. But in my own personal experience, taking even a minute or two to just stop and think about a situation or experience has allowed me to make effective decisions. While other times I've taken a whole day to kind of rest and let myself evaluate where I'm at in my headspace and in my work and what that looks like moving forward. Here's another quote that some of us are probably familiar with. I'm not actually sure who the original credit goes to, but it's experience is the best teacher, right? But let's take that to the next level and relate it to what we're talking about here. So another version of this quote is evaluated experience is the best teacher. To stop and think, how could I have handled this situation more effectively? Or how could I have presented those concepts more clearly? Or more long-term, where do I want to be by the end of this year? Right? I really connect with this version of the quote because it's a reminder not to just pause for the sake of pausing, right? But to really stop and evaluate what's going on around you. So some practical things that have been effective for me are writing. Write it out. Many times after a conversation with a colleague, a mentor, or even after meetings or reviews, I'll have my notes app open and I'll type out some key things that stood out to me. And recording those thoughts on paper or typing them out allows you to A, articulate your thoughts, and B, they serve as a reference place for you to go back to. There's many times where I went back to notes from months ago and I'm like, wow, that's something. And letting those simmer and having a place for them to sit, can a lot of times be valuable later on in the future. Another practical course of action you can take is talk it out. Sometimes we encounter challenges and experiences that are better suited for conversation. Having an open discussion or confiding in someone sometimes gives birth to these new ideas and insights, or what we would call aha moments. Reflection can allow us to dig deep within ourselves and uncover important pieces that we need to work on. They allow us to compare ourselves with ourselves, in a sense, and assess where we were, where we are now, and where we're going. So the takeaway here is that reflection can turn your experiences into insights that you can then use as a tool moving into the future. These insights, or these aha moments, can sometimes be small shifts in our thinking. And then some things just become that much clearer. And these small shifts, compounded over time, become significant in our craft and how we engage in our work. These small shifts also slowly help us build resilience over time as we encounter situations, right? Our insights and and the wisdom that we're building can help us navigate and handle situations more effectively than we would have before. So this brings me to some final thoughts to wrap up our time here. Today we talked about intent, that there's more to design than being a designer, and the act of reflection. And the lessons learned in these areas have been invaluable to me. And hopefully there was something for you all there too. But as impactful as those lessons are, I'd like to add one more piece to this, which is you, right? You're the important piece of this whole equation. Or in the wise words of my mother-in-law, she says, don't forget to bring you into the equation. And I love that. Your story, your journey, and your voice, they're unique to you. Your perspectives, your experiences, other skills that you have, those are things unique to you and only you can bring to the table. Allow those things to help you find joy in the challenges that we're solving as designers, knowing that we have an opportunity to have a voice and contribute to and to help shape something bigger than ourselves. So nurture that voice. It's actually what makes you memorable. Or as Dolly Parton probably says it better, she says, find out who you are and do it on purpose. And that wraps up our time here. So thank you all.
Hi, Randy. Thanks so much. I hope you can see all the claps and emojis that are floating over the screen right now.
Oh no, I can't see them.
There's been a whole lot during this whole talk, and it's been really wonderful. I feel really inspired after this talk, and even though these are lessons learned from your first year, I feel like there's applicable to no matter where you are in your career. And so I think that's really, really quite interesting and special about this talk too. But I do want to hop into a couple of the questions that we have from our audience.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, so I have I have one here from Sashna, and she says, "I'd like to know how you would start to chart out a plan if you're stuck with where to begin with." And I think this was coming from the very beginning of your talk when you're talking about having a target and having a plan and kind of like where you're going with that. And I'm wondering if maybe you could reflect on a time within a design project, within your own personal life or career, like that, like you felt. How did you get started on that plan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there's sort of like two answers I can give to that off the top of my head is identify what you're good at. So for me, like I knew that owning and trying, attempting to give my expertise on visual design was what I was good at, right? I didn't pretend to be this, senior researcher. I didn't pretend to be anything else. So I would say identify with what you're good at or where you feel, right? Let's say you're just starting out, where you feel, right, you're gravitating towards. For me, naturally, it was visual design. But then, as you're continuing to be in the trenches, right, in the weeds of projects, you start to notice that that's only one, one lens, right, one point of view that can limit you. So, when you start seeing other facets of design, whether that is UX research or motion, whatever it may be, right? My advice would be to try to find somebody that you can confide in and talk to, because a lot of times we don't realize that our next connection is right around the corner, right? With somebody that we may know. And I would also add, like, we have to take it upon ourselves to take that initiative to either reach out to people, find some resources, especially in this day and age, there's so many really good resources out there that we can learn from, whether it's a Medium article, a YouTube video. There are some things out there that can give you some really good insight, where sometimes we set up these roadblocks for ourselves, but when we kind of get our foot in the door, we're like, oh, that wasn't so bad, and you want to learn and learn more. So I would just say, based on what I just said, write them down, right? Write down maybe some 2 to 3 short-term ones, right? What do you want to achieve in the next 6 months? And then write down a few, right, over the next year, right? Where do you want to go and how are you going to get there? So that's would be my advice there.
Yeah, I love that too, especially that last part of like what it made me think of was like start small. Because sometimes
Yeah,
when it feels like this big, huge task that you want to get done, like even for me with work, sometimes it's like I have to break it down in these small little tasks because then I can feel like, oh, I've gotten part. I'm moving forward. There's something I'm getting to it. So yeah,
definitely.
don't overwhelm at first too. Like it can be chipping away at things.
100%. 100%. An ice sculpture isn't made with one chip. It takes time.
Yeah.
So start small.
Yeah, awesome. We have a question from Harshita here, and she has, do you have any advice, maybe specifically for someone who is a one-man team with no design mentor?
Gotcha. So and I'm assuming this is maybe, I don't know if you're independent, designer, freelance, or maybe might be an in-house designer and you're the only designer there,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I had actually experienced something similar, and before I was in the role I was in now, I was the only designer, right? I was in charge of marketing design, product design, bunch of design. But the the hard thing is that, and the challenge becomes is, you get so close to the work, you don't have anybody to bounce feedback off of. So what I would do, right, and I knew that that's what I needed, so I made some changes in what I was doing. But what my advice would be, if it's in your workplace, try to reach out to somebody, whether that's on LinkedIn or there's these meetup groups like this that we're having today, right? There are resources out there that are free of charge that, designers are actually nicer than most people think, right? So if you reach out, a lot, and obviously in a manner that's not non-obtrusive, right? A lot of times they're willing to kind of be like, kind of coach you through situations, and whether that's, a quick, quip of advice, like, hey, listen, I'm having an issue with this, or whether you start building this long-term relationship. What I would say is that also when you're finding someone to confide in, it takes an effort on your part, right? Because you're seeking the information. So it's not just like, give me, give me, give me. It's like, they have to know that they're investing their time into someone that's going to take it seriously, right? So that's what my advice would be. If you can't find it in your workplace, or if you can't find it close in your proximity, there are really good online resources that I would start reaching out to, whether that's meetup groups or design groups that you can find on LinkedIn, on Facebook. And I would also say just be transparent, right? Continue to be who you are. It helps you identify where you are in your path and where you stand. So that would definitely be my advice.
Yeah, I love that also about being transparent. No need to pretend like you're at a different level than you are necessarily, or like, I need help in this. And it's sometimes
Yeah.
hard to do that, but I think I love that you said that there too. Yeah. So I have a question here from Simona, and she says she's wondering, what would you say was the biggest challenge you face, and how did you overcome it? Yeah.
Oh man, that's a really good question. Ton of challenges, but let's see here. I think right off the bat, I would say being comfortable giving my point of view. A lot of my colleagues that I started working with have, years and upon years of experience. And when I'll give an example here, right? General example. When it came to either design reviews or presentations, or maybe we were reviewing like a range of concepts, right? Giving like my point of view, or actually like maybe disagreeing with somebody, was a challenge because, I'm not saying that, I was putting anybody on a pedestal, but you kind of like have respect for these people and sort of trust, like, they probably encountered this before. They probably know what they're talking about. And that was a challenge for me because a lot of times I would just stop maybe giving my rationale behind a decision and just go with it. But I think with time and experience, you learn to develop, like, it's not necessarily like you're getting into an argument. You're having a conversation about what's best for the end user or what's best for the end product. And, be prepared to come with your rationale, be prepared to come with the reasons why you think what you're bringing to the table may be stronger than maybe another solution that's out there. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges that I've faced, and even faced recently, is just having that point of view and expressing it, but in a manner that's not disrespectful, right? You want to, obviously respect these people around you. So, but yeah, you have a voice. That's why they hire us as designers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely hard to find that voice sometimes, at any stage in your, I feel like, yeah, at any stage in your career, it can be difficult too.
100%.
But yeah, I think like you just have to do it. You just have to jump into it sometimes, even if it feels uncomfortable. And
yeah.
But what you said, when you have the thought behind it and the preparation and the like, kind of not always evidence, but like the support, the where it's coming from, you're not pulling it out of nowhere. There's a background, there's an expertise that you're coming with. So
yes, 100%. And it takes time to like come with that preparation. It actually it involves effort, it involves planning, but that's our job, right? So
yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. One just popped up, which I'm
Sure.
curious about, which is, it says, is UI practice enough to grow as a designer? And I'm curious about this because I know from your own background, obviously you have the visual background and you do a lot of visual design work and more of that side of it. But I know you have a huge passion and curiosity for the strategic side and how actually visual design fits into the strategic too. So if you just could, what is your opinions on that?
Can you just ask the question one more time?
Sure. So the question from Shivama was, is UI practice enough to grow as a designer? And I added the
rest. Good. Good question. Good question. Because, similar to myself, as Hannah mentioned, that was like what I started with. And I think it's a good starting point, right? There's this ever-changing landscape of design where it's sort of like it's becoming more and more apparent that wearing different hats is becoming more common, and that's just the reality of it, So I would say, yes, just like our question earlier, where we were saying start small. UI design is a great way to like get yourself familiar with what's going on in the landscape, especially if it's something that you're already naturally gravitated towards. Man, play into those strengths, double down on them. But then it's like, okay, cool, you have this one tool under your belt. You have a really good hammer, right? What are these other tools that I'm going to need to build this house? Right? So start exploring those other things and how it fits into this bigger picture of design, because what I've learned, right, and I'm continuing to learn these things, but is if you're kind of like sort of like going down this single path, you unfortunately you may miss things that are either impactful to the solution or the problem space, right? And you may end up not delivering something as strong as you would if you worked on these other facets of design, right? Design is an ever-growing beast, but my advice would be, yes, start with maybe what you're gravitated towards, but then, and I feel naturally you'll start seeing like, oh yes, of course, the research phase is such an important piece to why we're making a visual decision in the first place. So you'll see how these things are interconnected, and it'll just continue to make you a better, more effective designer, which is our goal, right? So yes, that would be my answer.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Randy. So on that, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful seeing this whole process with you, and so excited to see how today turned out.